I'd like to first thank our partner, American University School of Public Affairs, and the First Ladies Initiative there, and our Flair Institutional Lifetime members, Rider University, White House Historical Association, the Massachusetts Historical Association, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, the National First Ladies Library, and Southern Methodist Center for Presidential History. I'm really excited about a program tonight, and again, I apologize for the delay, on Pat Nixon, who is an unheralded First Lady. And this program should be a fascinating and enlightening look at a First Lady whose achievements are still not that well known. Hence the panel name. What she did, which is a lot, was overshadowed by her husband's administration and the Watergate controversies. A measure of her popularity can be seen in her 1972 appearance before the Republican National Convention. She was the first Lady to appear before the RNC, and she got an 8-minute standing ovation. She could not gavel the crowd down. Ronald Reagan could not gavel the crowd down, and even Jimmy Stewart. And she was enjoying it, but at a certain point, she wanted to make her brief remarks. She then did make brief remarks, but that shows you just how popular she was. And the majority of the audience was young people cheering her. Tonight, we are lucky to have Chair Linda Hobgood, the director of the University of Michigan Speech Center. Linda has the unique perspective of having worked in Pat Nixon's First Lady's office. Dr. Mary Brennan, professor of history and dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Texas State University and author of Pat Nixon, Embattled First Lady, which is an excellent biography. And then we have Heath Hardage Lee, an independent historian, biographer, and curator who specializes in women's history and who is currently working on a wonderful biography of Pat Nixon, which we all look forward to reading, and it will have a lot of new primary source material. We will take questions at the end of the program, which should be emailed to firstladies2021@gmail.com. More biographic information on our panelists is available on the Flair website. Now, with great pleasure, I turn over the program to Linda.
Thank you, Nancy. And thank you also to the First Ladies Association for Research and Education for making possible this opportunity to share recollections of Pat Nixon as First Lady. A favorite and lasting memory of mine is shaking her hand at the Cherry Blossom Festival in the spring of 1973. The receiving line to greet Mrs. Nixon was long, but the First Lady was taking time for each person she met. She did so in a very special way, taking my hand and clasping it between both of hers. She held it and her eyes met mine. We exchanged a smile. In that moment, she would make you feel as though you were the only person in the room. There was a combined warmth and shyness that lingered long after the moment. I watched her for a long time that afternoon from a distance as she treated each person she met with that distinctly genuine grace and generosity of spirit that she had shown me. Mrs. Nixon was never about power, and the last person she seemed to concentrate on was herself. But she was very aware of the potential of a public position and the means it contained for celebrating others, highlighting their gifts, making every person with whom she came in contact know they were special. If you look at pictures from her White House years, so often she nudges someone else toward the center of the photo, or she smiles at them instead of at the camera. Official pictures highlight these visitors to the White House, underscoring her conviction that this is the people's house after all. The more I look back at her life and her tenure as First Lady, the more valuable it becomes to remember the circumstances of her birth and childhood. She knew poverty and deprivation and grew up taking very little for granted. She could identify with those who may never have even dreamed of visiting Washington or the White House, let alone shaking the hand of someone who lived there. She never forgot those with whom she grew up, taught, and worked alongside, what they valued and needed. That was likely key to her ability to relate so beautifully to others. When I arrived at the White House in the summer of '73, I was sort of a pest in asking everyone I met to recall their favorite moment while working at the Nixon White House. Without exception, and without having to think about it, each person recalled the POW dinner on May 24th, 1973. It was a star-studded outdoor White House lawn event. Former prisoners of war met each other for the first time, some having communicated from chains in the same prison. The President and Mrs. Nixon greeted all 1,300 guests that evening and invited them to stay at the White House as long as they wished, and saying it was the least they deserved. You can see also in these pictures how much Mrs. Nixon valued personal contact with those who were in the hospital, those in harm's way, and she would personally take notes when she greeted them to take messages back to their loved ones, if at all possible. If there was something special they wanted them to know, Mrs. Nixon made sure that she made those correspondences or those phone calls personally. Correspondence was important to Mrs. Nixon on several levels. It reflected that people were worth time and thought. She resisted the signature pen, preferring to sign her letters, and in so many cases, wrote those letters in longhand. She had visited constituents as the wife of a House and Senate member and as Second Lady for 8 years, and she had seen letters or signed photographs from the President and First Lady framed and hanging in places of honor in each home. If others were concerned with voting blocks or large segments of the population, Pat Nixon cared for people, one person or small group at a time, whenever she could. And even if it meant writing letters all day long or hosting visitors for hours on end and shaking hands until the last guest extended a hand, that was what she did. We were reminded that the White House stationery was provided by the taxpayers. We were not to make typographical errors or let a letter be mailed with any stray marks or smudges ever. Mrs. Nixon had a way with people, children especially. Her conversations with them were legend. One little boy, with numerous health challenges, doubted that she really lived in the White House. And when Mrs. Nixon inquired as to why, he said it was because he didn't see a washing machine anywhere. So she gave him her hand and invited him to take a firsthand look at her washing machine. He returned satisfied that she lived there. But the boy's parents were amazed. It was the first time ever that their son had left them to accompany without apprehension another adult in his young and challenged life. It was not unusual for adult visitors at the White House to be overwhelmed in the presence of the First Lady. Mrs. Nixon would respond with a hug. I saw her embrace a timid guest more than once as a gesture of understanding and warm welcome. But one time it was so poignant that as I returned to the office, I myself started crying. Helen Smith, Mrs. Nixon's press secretary, put her arm around me, and I apologized for getting emotional, but she responded, "No, this is good for us to see. Otherwise, we might take for granted what Mrs. Nixon does again and again." Mrs. Nixon was beloved by the White House staff. Their tears as she left the White House on August 9th, 1974, were profuse and heart-wrenching. It was as though the entire household was weeping. I stood on the balcony in between William Simon and the White House chef, both in tears, and members of the White House press corps, one of whom had been a former student of hers, privately confided that abiding admiration and deep respect was something he held for her always. Members of her staff, Lucy Winchester, Helen Smith, Gwen King, Susan Porter Rose, Patty Mattson, Susan Dolliboy, and Cindy Vanden Heuvel were gems. Mrs. Nixon was that sparkling diamond, and each one was a facet. They knew her, and they knew exactly what she expected and hoped for as First Lady. Like their mother, daughters Tricia and Julie were unfailingly kind, always gracious in lending support to their mother and father. By the time she became First Lady, Mrs. Nixon had had the opportunity to observe the activities of at least 4 First Ladies. She had been, after all, Second Lady for 8 years. President Eisenhower and the traveling press corps had applauded her gifts of diplomacy, especially in dangerous, hostile situations. Their admiration continued when, as First Lady, she traveled to the Soviet Union and to the People's Republic of China, among so many other trips. On a trip to Italy with the president, she purposely spent a quiet evening in her room so that the press pool assigned to her might enjoy an evening out on the town in Rome. Her keen understanding of public service, to celebrate others' gifts and accomplishments, and to honor their hard work and dedication, came with the long view of history in mind. A favorite afternoon came in the summer of 1973, when the eagerly awaited children's company of the then Soviet Union's Bolshoi Ballet visited the White House. They had performed the night before at a new outdoor theater called Wolf Trap in nearby Northern Virginia. And that night they were to perform again at the Kennedy Center. But press coverage of their performance the night before had been lukewarm. The little ballerinas were not used to public criticism. They seemed skeptical about the sincerity of the First Lady who had seen them perform in Moscow and had so enthusiastically invited them to come visit America. A receiving line was formed, but the first few little girls proceeded gingerly, shyly toward the First Lady. Then, as one little girl was introduced to Mrs. Nixon, the translator murmured her name, which was Zura, and said that today was her birthday. Mrs. Nixon brightened and asked, "How old?" Before the chaperone could ask Zura, Mrs. Nixon held up her hands so as to count fingers. And in that beautiful means of communication that surpasses language, Zura began to hold up one hand like this. Then she held up the other hand, and then she held up a finger. Mrs. Nixon imitated the gesture of 11 fingers and then embraced Zura. Thousands of miles from home, this little girl needed a birthday hug. The little girls who had already gone through the line did an about face, and they ran back clamoring for their hugs from the First Lady. What had begun as a tense moment ended in warmth and human kindness, so hoped for in those Cold War days. Our very first First Lady, Martha Washington, is quoted as having said that happiness did not depend on circumstances, but on one's disposition. Pat Nixon made it her purpose to bring joy to others at every turn, and by that measure, she was a resounding success. And now, Dr. Mary Brennan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Linda. Had a little technology thing of my own right there. Thank you to Flair and to Linda and to Nancy for the great introduction. I want to talk tonight, and I gave my presentation this title, but I have to confess that I don't think Pat would really have liked the title because she didn't choose a career in politics. But she did, in fact, work throughout her entire life beside and sometimes around her husband in his decades-long career in government service. While the world and certainly the media focused on what they perceived to be her traditional image. Keegan, you can go to the next slide. I'm going to just say next, and you can go ahead and click through them. So they focused on her image as a woman of a family, a traditional wife and mother, somebody who just participated in politics as an extension of her husband. And ultimately, through all of this, they kind of created this image of her as this plastic woman who is plastic Pat, who just smiled on cue and didn't really have a personality of her own. I argue that all of that image missed her, what I would argue is a subconscious agenda of making government accessible to everyone. Now, I'm going to offer two examples to support my argument. One is Pat's behavior during her foreign travels, and the other is her White House restoration efforts. But before I get to those examples, I want to go back to something that Linda mentioned at the very beginning of our talk, and that is that we need to understand where Mrs. Nixon came from. She came from very humble origins. She was born in a miner's hut. Her family moved to a truck farm in California. She lost her mother when she was 13 and her father when she was 18. She worked her whole life. Go ahead, Keegan. In fact, at one point during her career, while she was trying to earn money to support her father and her brothers, and then later to support her brothers through college and then put herself through college, she once drove a car across the country on her own just to earn some money. She worked in a lab, she worked on campus, so she was always working. And I mention this because this background leads to where she understands what it is to be excluded, to be someone who was, in a sense, kept out of everything else. And she never forgot that. When people would talk about her correspondence and be upset with her for her emphasis on the correspondence and on taking part in that, she would say that she knew how much a letter with a Washington, D.C. postmark meant to someone living in a small town. She recognized the impact that could have. Now we can see this remembrance of how things are and her insistence on kind of making everyone feel appreciated throughout her travels when she traveled in an official capacity. And we see this first during her vice presidential years. She was, when they first became the second couple, President Eisenhower sent them off on a 3-month tour of Southeast Asia. Actually, it was kind of almost an around the world tour. And everywhere that she went, even though as second lady, she had an official agenda of teas and galas and things that were really kind of put her in the company of the elite, she refused to just be limited to that. Go ahead, Keegan. And you're going to flip through the slides on this. She insisted that she was going to go out and meet children. No, can you go back? She was going to go to hospitals. She was going to go to where, no, go forward. There we go. All right, and we'll stay on this one for a minute. And that she was going to meet children. She was going to go out and go through the barrier. She didn't just want to talk to the people that she was supposed to talk to. She wanted to talk to everyone. And I will point out that the picture in the upper right, that is Mrs. Nixon with Mrs. Khrushchev. When they were in the Soviet Union in 1958, Pat was at a dinner and she noticed that she was the only wife there. And so she asked Mr. Khrushchev, "Where's your wife? Why are there no other wives here?" And lo and behold, the next day, Mrs. Khrushchev was there and she was attending events as well. Now, Mrs. Khrushchev was not usually invited to these kind of events, and she was very nervous. She was a shy woman, and she was very nervous. So Pat, as you can see in this picture, went up, put her arm around her, and led her through the event so that she would not have to be frightened. The same kind of feeling continues when she becomes First Lady. The first real opportunity she has to travel, go ahead, Keegan, is due to a tragedy there was a massive earthquake in Peru. And the Americans were sending in all kinds of donations and blankets and food and money. And so President Nixon said, "Well, I think, Pat, you should take this and personally go take this to Peru." And so she did. She flew on a plane, she carried everything down there, but then she didn't just drop everything off. Instead, she went out with the First Lady of Peru. They climbed through the rubble. She visited with people. She gave out hugs to children. She gave out hugs to everyone who was so devastated by this. And the Peruvians were so impressed by this that they actually awarded her their top honor. Her value in terms of bringing the personal touch to all of her foreign travels was something else that the president recognized. And so despite the fact that his advisors did not want him to do so, go ahead, Keegan, when he went to China, he insisted that Mrs. Nixon had to go with her. There's one more picture on that slide, actually one more. And I want you to notice that she's wearing this bright red coat. She's traveling around. You can see in the picture on the top right that you can see her Chinese interpreters. And then you see all of those people behind her. That's the media. They followed her everywhere because President Nixon was in closed door meetings. So she was the one who became the tour guide for the American public as they traveled around. I also want you to notice the pictures of the Chinese people, the Chinese children in this picture on the left and down here on the right, and the delight of the faces of the people behind her in the picture where she's clearly in a kitchen. And I had to tell a little story here. So they took her into this kitchen and the chefs there said, oh, no, this is too spicy for you. You will never be able to do this. And she insisted that she was going to eat it. And when she did, and she actually swallowed it, you can see the delight on the faces of the people behind her, because again, she recognized and validated everything that was going on. The last picture that I have here of her travels is really in some ways, I think, one of the highlights of her career, and she saw it like that way. Go ahead, Keegan, to the next slide. And this is actually her trip to Liberia. She's the first lady to have an official, to be the official representative to an inauguration of a foreign leader. And so she goes, and so you can see the official pictures, but just as Linda showed that picture, this is one of my favorite pictures of Mrs. Nixon. And we were talking before the presentation that the joy on her face in this picture is just so beautiful and so incredible. And it's her joy at being able to be a part of other people's culture, recognizing what was going on and having them accept her as part of everything that they were doing. Now, her efforts with her foreign travels are not the only example I want to use. And I do want to shift the attention back to her efforts at home. When she came into the White House, one of the things that she was determined was that she wanted the White House to become the people's house. And if it was going to be the people's house, then it had to be all the people. She was very insistent that the White House was not just a place for the big shots to come in. It was for all of the people. Go ahead, Keegan. And how do you make the White House accessible to the people? Well, she looked for different ways to say, all right, who is being excluded? So one thing she felt was there were all these people who lived in Washington, D.C., drove past the White House every day and never saw it. So she had it illuminated. In November of 1970, the White House was illuminated for the first time in the evening. And then they opened it up and let tours so that working people who could not come during a normal workday could come and visit the White House. So this is Mrs. Nixon leading one of the nighttime tours. Go ahead. She also revived a pre-World War II event by opening the White House grounds for one weekend in the spring and one weekend in the fall. It had been closed since Pearl Harbor. She revived the tradition in 1973, and she and President Nixon led the first group through the garden. Go ahead. As you have seen it in the previous pictures, Mrs. Nixon was very interested in trying to make children feel at home, to make foreign diplomats and their families feel at home. Up in the top left, she's actually, we can't see the tour guides, but she's actually speaking to a group of tour guides. And she was insistent that one of the things that the tour guides had to do was make sure that they spoke facing the people, that the tours that they were leading, because she wanted them, especially if they were hard of hearing people, to be able to understand what was going on. Go on. She wanted the White House to be open and accessible to everyone. You'll notice in the picture on the left, if you look carefully, the children all have gloves on. They have gloves on because all of the children are visually impaired. And so they're being allowed to feel the statue. They would do the same thing with adults, again with the white gloves, and they would take them around and let them feel some of the wallpaper and feel some of the furnishings. When Mrs. Nixon got to the White House, she realized that no one in a wheelchair would be able to take advantage of anything she was doing because there were no ramps. And so she insisted on putting ramps in and on the east wing and the north portico. She was determined that the White House was going to be accessible to as many people as possible. Now, in doing that, in making the White House accessible, she also wanted to show it off as a showplace. Let's go to the next couple of slides. And this is Mrs. Nixon with the Committee for the Preservation of the White House. Go ahead, Keegan. And this is Clement Conger, who helped her with this process. Go ahead. And so these pictures, you can see she's showing off the she's showing off some of the changes that they've made. She and Clement Conger would go around and look for appropriate pieces of furnishings. They were, go ahead, go to the next slide. They would try to get donations to get what they needed, to get the proper furnishings, to kind of continue the process Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Johnson had begun. One last slide. They go ahead. They were insistent that they were going to find the paintings. This is one of their greatest triumphs, was getting the portrait of Dolly Madison, which had been removed famously when the White House was being burned back in the War of 1812. But to get that on loan, to find it and get it loaned back to the White House, and then eventually to be able to have it released to them. By the time, go ahead to the last slide. By the time that she left the White House in 1974, she had added more than 500 18th and 19th century pieces of American furniture, artwork, chandeliers, and rugs to the collection. Many were loaned, some were purchased, all with donations that she helped to create. Now, Pat didn't receive much of any recognition from the media or the public for her efforts abroad or at home. I don't think that recognition was not her goal. Her goal was to bring people in and make them feel that they were a part of the government. And I think, and to that extent, she very much succeeded. Thank you. Heath, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Mary. And I'm going to first want to thank, of course, Flair for having us, and Diana Carlin, who coordinated a lot of this and couldn't be with us tonight. But thank you, Nancy, Linda, and Mary. Excellent presentations, and they all paved the way for this last part. I'm going to talk specifically about Mrs. Nixon and women's issues tonight. I'm going to touch on just a little bit of what Mary was talking about briefly about Mrs. Nixon's early life. As she mentioned, Thelma Catherine Ryan, later Pat Nixon, was born in a 2-room rented miner's shack in Ely, Nevada on March 16, 1912. And I think where she is born, place is always so important in the formation of people's character. And I don't think enough has been written about the frontier mentality and the frontier culture that Pat Nixon was born into, or rather Thelma Ryan at that point. Partially due to the more equal partnership demanded within this frontier culture, Western women had more rights during the settlement era than their sisters did back east. Women achieved enfranchisement in the western states of Arizona, Kansas, and Oregon in 1912, the same year that Mrs. Nixon was born. Her home state of Nevada was not far behind, recognizing women's right to vote in 1914, so 6 years prior to the passing of the National Suffrage Amendment in 1920. I wanted to point out that mining couples like Pat's parents, Will and Kate Ryan, well understood what Montana Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin articulated, quote, men and women are like right and left hands. It doesn't make sense not to use both. Pat's family really exemplified that kind of work ethic and frontier ethic in the way they lived and worked together. Pat and her family moved to Artesia, which is now Cerritos, California, in 1913. Her father, Will, bought a small farm there and raised vegetables. Kate, her mother, Pat, and her 2 brothers all worked together to help Will make this farm a success. So she knew very hard work very early on. Mary also showed you some pictures and mentioned other things that Mrs. Nixon did. She was a career woman, a very self-made woman before she met Richard Nixon. Her mother died, of course, when she was 13, and her father died when she was 18. She helped raise those two brothers she had, helped put them through school, and eventually she herself graduated from the University of Southern California. She had jobs all along in New York as an X-ray technician in a hospital for those with tuberculosis. She worked in Los Angeles as a clothing model and sales girl. She even worked in Hollywood as an actress doing small bit parts until she became a business teacher at Whittier Union High School. So I tell you all this about her background and her work experience because she was raised, Mrs. Nixon was raised to believe that women could do whatever they set their minds to. There was never a question in her mind that women should be able to have a career and family together if that's what they chose. I also wanted to point out that Richard Nixon's mother, Hannah, came from a long line of devout Quakers, and the president's grandmother, Elmira Millhouse, was a very strong female role model for him. That Quaker religion that the president was surrounded by also made a very strong impression on him about women because women were preachers, they were teachers, they were Sunday school leaders. His mother, Hannah, also worked in the grocery business. So Richard Nixon also saw that women could be strong leaders, community leaders, as well as the career women and mothers and wives as well at home. They could have it all. So both Mrs. Nixon and President Nixon had that vision and had that modeling growing up. So I wanted to talk a little bit about also his two daughters, Tricia and Julie, who also represented that younger generation of Republican women who strongly believed that women should be able to do whatever they wanted to do, just like both their parents did, that women could be in the workplace and also be at home to do it all. They supported, like their mother, programs within the Nixon administration that aimed to elevate women in government and in the working world. So we'll go to the next slide now. So here we have President Nixon with Barbara Hackman Franklin, and her job was to get more women into higher level government positions. So when Barbara Franklin comes into the Nixon administration, into the West Wing to do her work, I'll tell you a little bit more about that. The context between Barbara's move into the Nixon administration as staff assistant to the president with this assignment to get more women in government. Keep in mind, we've had the advent of the birth control pill in 1960, sort of kicking things off for women, freeing them up a lot more to be in the work world. We have the civil rights movement going on, the Vietnam War. We have the feminist movement at this point. So we've got all these things swirling around, creating a situation where women are beginning to be taken much more seriously, to be much more of a voting rights group also, though they have had the vote for a long, long time. Things are only starting to really heat up in the 60s and 70s for women having more leadership roles in the government. So in 1971, Barbara comes in as staff assistant to the president. And her quote that she gave me was interesting. She said, quote, "It was kind of a vacuum when I came in. There was a bit of force building up there, more of a push for women in government. Although the women's movement, female reporters were trying to move women's issues forward, Barbara Franklin told me she also thought that a few good women behind the scenes gently pushed President Nixon along." Barbara's quote, "I think President Nixon's mother, Hannah, who I talked about earlier, and Mrs. Nixon had a lot to do with this attitude, also his two daughters. There was beginning to be a political need or rationale for supporting women's roles outside the home." So that is what we are beginning to look at. Also, I want to set the scene once when Barbara comes on board. This is a little previous to her coming on board. At President Nixon's second press conference, Vera Glazer, who was the Washington bureau chief for a former North American newspaper alliance, asked the president a question no one had expected. Her question was, quote, "Mr. President, in staffing your administration, you have so far made about 200 high-level cabinet and other policy position appointments, and only 3 have gone to women. Can you tell us, sir, whether we can expect more equitable recognition of women's abilities, or are we going to remain the lost sex?" And Glazer's question was what pushed things along to get Barbara Franklin involved, to get her there as staff assistant to the president, to really push for this. And what happened was that Barbara was extremely successful. She had attended Harvard Business School, and she used objective-based managerial principles to find qualified women for high-level government roles and mid-level government roles by developing a talent bank of women. The talent bank would also identify qualified women on the mid to lower levels, women whose names we may not know, but who changed history all the same: female tugboat captains, forest rangers, sky marshals, and FBI agents. So without that serious support from the president and the support from Mrs. Nixon and the 2 daughters behind the scenes, Barbara told me she did not think the advances that were made and the barriers that were broken for women could ever have happened at that particular time in our country. So that was all going on behind the scenes with Mrs. Nixon, Julie Eisenhower, and Tricia Cox, all pushing for these things and supporting Barbara and the other women in the West Wing behind the scenes. I also wanted to comment on Mrs. Nixon and the East Wing, West Wing operations. Mrs. Nixon was fully in charge of the East Wing and her staff, despite numerous attempts from the West Wing to take control of the East Wing or minimize her operation. Mrs. Nixon strongly resisted those attempts and ran her own show. She was often in conflict with Bob Haldeman, the president's chief of staff, over coverage of press events and how she was presented or not presented politically. She and her East Wing staff pushed back behind the scenes against this. Sometimes they prevailed, but sometimes not. Mrs. Nixon's popularity with the American public was massive and consistent, not only during the time of both Nixon administrations, but also long after this. So she always retained that popularity. And she was perhaps the Nixon White House's greatest PR asset. Even so, the West Wing seemed very threatened by her ubiquitous presence on the most admired women's list. And they did not promote her like they should have, even when the president himself urged them to do so. Let's move on to the next slide. Now, I love this slide because Mrs. Nixon is indeed the first lady to wear pants in public. Here she is at Yellowstone National Park in September of 1972. I wanted to give you just briefly run through another list of firsts for Mrs. Nixon that are pretty striking and very, very definitive for her time as First Lady. She was the first incumbent First Lady since Eleanor Roosevelt to address a national political convention. She was the first incumbent First Lady to support the Equal Rights Amendment. This was quite appropriate for a woman who'd worked as an economist during World War II. Her quote, "I am for women, I am for equal rights and equal pay for equal work," she said. Quote, "I competed against and worked with men." In 1972, she reflected it was, quote, "time to formally recognize that women in employment and other areas deserved equal treatment with men." Traveling in Yugoslavia, she offered the opinion that its parliament, as well as the US Congress, had too few women. Pat Nixon was the first modern first lady to sit in on a cabinet meeting as an observer who hoped to, quote, make women part of the administration. Mrs. Nixon was also the first lady to use the word abortion in public. She said it in the context of being pro-abortion rights. Quote, I think abortion is a personal choice. Finally, Pat Nixon was our first lady to publicly call for a woman on the Supreme Court, saying, quote, our population is more than 50% women, so why not? A woman will help balance the court. She pushed very hard for a woman on the Supreme Court and was, quote, annoyed, which I think was an understatement on her part, when the West Wing staff claimed they could not find a qualified woman. We'll go to the next slide. And these last two slides are personal slides given to me from East Wing staff that I thought the audience would enjoy seeing, just to show the warmth and the relaxed nature that Linda particularly was talking about in terms of Mrs. Nixon, how she interacted with her own East Wing staff. So in this slide, we have Mrs. Nixon's staff director and press secretary, Connie Stewart, holding a press conference in 1973. And I hope you can see that Mrs. Nixon is just very casually sitting on the floor with the rest of her staff. I don't know a lot of first ladies that would be so cheerful and casual like that. I just like that. I think that shows you that she was not so formal. She was casual and very relaxed with her staff. The next slide and the last slide is a wonderful picture from Christmas of 1973. Mrs. Nixon always made a point to have staff parties, Christmas parties with her staff, not only for Christmas, but other fun events like Halloween, other times during the year. And also just nice meetings she would have with her East Wing staff to thank them profusely many times for what they were doing. She would have meetings to give them to sort of just hang out with them, give them baby gifts, birthday gifts, handwritten notes, always made the staff feel so appreciated, according to all the interviews I've done without exception. Her staff also told me she always wanted her staff to have great experiences while they were there, to be part of the history of the White House that they were sharing with the public. Things like going on cruises on the Sequoia, on the boat that the White House had, the very large yacht really that they had to go around and enjoy. And they would bring on children to the Sequoia, and it did many events on there. They would also meet celebrities. They would do all kinds of very special things. And she wanted the staff to really enjoy that time. And the last thing I'll say was a very short little story that her social secretary, Mrs. Nixon's social secretary, told me about Mrs. Nixon. Lucy Winchester, the social secretary, had a little girl they called Little Lucy, her mother's daughter, who had gotten a pet frog. Mrs. Nixon, as busy as she was, took the time to go around the White House and collect flies for little Lucy from some of the White House drapes that tended to attract these flies. And she caught them all up in a jar and gave them to little Lucy to feed her pet frog. I just thought that was such a charming story, and showed, again, Linda had also mentioned the love of children that Mrs. Nixon had. I thought that was truly above and beyond. So I just wanted to end with that and concur with Mary and Linda. There is no such thing as plastic, Pat. That is purely a media construct. And I think that is just a false narrative that needs to be corrected. So thank you so much.
Thank you to the panelists. I think it has been fascinating. I apologize again for our technical difficulties, but I think we got over them. One thing I did want to say when we were talking earlier is part of Pat Nixon's being unheralded is that you have to realize she was the only first lady from Mrs. Johnson forward who did not do her own memoir. Later on, Julie did a biography, but she was very reticent about herself. So that's another element. But I also think that what the panelists were saying in terms of the West Wing, which is the president's staff, and the East Wing was true. And she wasn't empowered in the way some other first ladies were. Now, we do have some questions. I thought it was a fascinating panel. The questions, one is, as Heath Lee talks about the East Wing struggles, it seems that the West Wing staff overshadowed Mrs. Nixon's achievements and her efforts toward equality. How does history rectify that issue? I wonder why Tricia and Julie have not publicly written about their mother as a person driven by principles of equality. And that is from our own Flair, Jody Naftali. And Heath and Mary, have you disappeared? Could you please put your video and audio on?
Yes, I'm on.
Yes, I'm on too.
Okay, so you're not showing. So if you could put your audio on, your video on. Okay. Who would like to take Jody's question?
I'm happy to start on that. So, I think it's good to have an outside person talking about some of this, because it's difficult, I think, if you're a daughter, to talk about your mother. It's just, that's a hard task to put on them. So I think it's our job as historians. I know Mary has talked in her wonderful book about these issues of equality. And I tend to really, that tends to be something I'm very interested in. So I plan to go very deep on equality issues. And I think Mrs. Nixon felt very strongly. The ERA is a great example. I think she tees that up and moves the needle forward. And then Betty Ford is able to really take the ERA and run with it. So she does kind of all the teeing up for that issue. And she does it not only by supporting the ERA, but also all of those other things I listed off that she did that were groundbreaking, including things that may not seem so groundbreaking to us now, but things like wearing pants, just simple things like that. But pushing for a woman on the Supreme Court, I will have a lot in my book about this, that she was very upset that did not happen. She had publicly wanted that to happen. And Barbara Franklin and her talent bank, also, that was one of their very first things they tried to do, was to find an appropriate candidate. And again, they were able to set that up. So 10 years later, Sandra Day O'Connor, which was identified by Barbara's talent bank under Reagan, she becomes the first female Supreme Court justice. So I think a lot of what Mrs. Nixon does is the teeing up of these issues from what had been kind of at a low boil on the JFK and LBJ administrations, and bringing it up to that medium boil, and then it takes off. So she moved the needle quite a bit.
Heath, I would say, having worked with Mrs. Johnson and knowing President Johnson's record, I do feel that he did quite a bit for women at a high level in his administration, and that Mrs. Johnson, with civil rights and beautification and environment, teed it up. So I sort of see it as more an evolutionary. Mrs. Johnson did not, that I know of, push for a woman on the Supreme Court, but she pushed environment in a way that very few people have. And so I think it is an evolutionary process. In terms of, I had a question, which I thought I'd throw out to the panel, which is, What do you feel was nearest and dearest to Mrs. Nixon's heart? And maybe Linda, do you want to comment? What of the things that Mrs. Nixon cared about was the one that was maybe her nearest and dearest to her heart? Can you unmic?
She was quoted so often as saying, "People are my project." I think Mrs. Nixon, I think one of the things looking back that she would have been most gratified by were the numbers of people who gained access to the White House that might never have been able to visit before. The nighttime visitors, those who had health challenges that she was able to bring in. There's a coterie in Washington of lobbyists and public servants who regularly visit the White House. And quite frankly, it can almost become routine if you're part of the bureaucracy in Washington. She wanted to bring people to the White House who had never been there before and who would talk about it to their children and grandchildren. And that was, and she wanted to make that possible. It was, if however long they were going to be in the White House, Mrs. Nixon really wanted to make it available to as many as possible. She also cared about historic preservation. And then there were those who she knew would treasure a visit to the White House for different reasons. When the portraits of President and Mrs. Kennedy were hung at the White House, she invited Jacqueline Kennedy to come, and Mrs. Kennedy just did not desire an entourage with the press. And Mrs. Nixon put her own reputation at tremendous personal risk by promising Mrs. Kennedy that if she and her children would like to come, she would guarantee their complete privacy and would not even tell the press that they were coming. And so that she didn't compromise her press secretary, Helen Smith, she kept it a secret from Helen. And she and the president and her daughters greeted and hosted dinner for Mrs. Kennedy and Caroline and John Jr. after seeing their parents' portraits. And Mrs. Kennedy, Caroline, and John each wrote 3 individual letters to the Nixons that are absolutely beautiful about finally getting to see where they had spent their young years in the White House. Mrs. Nixon said it was one of the greatest days of her life, and she had dreaded it because she really didn't want to face the press. She wanted a private visit, and Mrs. Nixon made it possible. And again, at great personal risk. It was really a coup on Mrs. Nixon's part, but that's the extent to which she was willing to go to honor people who wanted to be there, needed to be there, and she felt as though she owed it to them. She really did. I also am conscious of the fact that she didn't really want to. She didn't want to cause trouble for her president, for her husband as president, and for the West Wing staff. That wasn't her. She wasn't out on a cause that would prove contentious. That wasn't her thing. People really were her project. And she made, and that was a long view of history. There were things that she knew over time would wear well.
That was a fascinating answer. We are running long, but we're running long partly because of our technical difficulties. So there's one more question, and any of you can answer it, but we've gotten a question. How much do we know about the relationship of Mrs. Nixon between Judy Agnew and Betty Ford?
Oh,
Mary?
I'm afraid that I really can't answer that question.
Okay.
I think probably maybe Linda or Heath would be able to do a better job. I don't really have a lot of information on that.
Betty Ford, I can certainly talk about, and Linda probably can even may even know more. Judy Agnew, I don't know as much, but she and Betty Ford were dear friends and had known each other for many, many years and had sort of come up together in Washington. So they had a very close relationship even after she left the White House. So very different personalities, kind of night and day. And that's what I found so interesting in researching them both. I kind of see Mrs. Nixon as teeing some of the women's issues up, and then Betty takes them and puts them in the spotlight because, as we've all said, Mrs. Nixon was very private. She didn't like the spotlight. She didn't want that. And I think Mrs. Ford perhaps enjoyed the spotlight a little bit more. So interesting contrast, because they were very dear friends, even though they were quite different.
Well, I think this is just, we could go on. We may do this again in a non-technical, problematic way, but I've got to thank Linda and Mary and Heath for a truly wonderful and enlightening panel. And I would like to let people know that Flair has some more upcoming programs, which we will advertise on the Flair website. We have a social coming up for Flair members that we will also advertise shortly. And we have a lot of interesting things. If you are new to the First Ladies Association for Research and Education, and you like our panels, we would be delighted for you to join us. Go to flair-net.org. We feel like we have really made a lot of headway, and we are approaching also giving our next event will be awarding the Lewis L. Gould Award, which will be June 21st. So watch our webpage, and any Flair member who would like to get a nomination in, I think next Monday closes the nominations. But I would like to thank you, Mary, Linda, Heath. It was a really wonderful program, and I learned so much, and I really think we can certainly do other programs on this First Lady who really did so much, and the light is beginning to shine on her. So thank you very much, and thank you for our audience for joining us.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.